Welcome back to Bold Dominion, a state news explainer podcast for a changing Virginia. I'm Mary Garner McGee. This time of year, there is a ton of news about the Virginia General Assembly. Bills being proposed, bills being passed through committee, and soon, crossover. If these words have you spelunking into the depths of your high school civics class, we are here to give you a refresh. I'm joined today by my WTJU colleague, Sage Tangway.
Hello.
So, Sage, we both grew up in Virginia and learned about the General Assembly in school. What do you already know about our state legislature?
Almost next to nothing, which is pretty surprising to me. I actually have a pretty good grip on our national legal processes, and I had always thought, I paid a good amount of attention in my civics classes. But when you asked me, what do I know about the General Assembly, I was like, oh, I don't know. Is that our state Senate? Is that what it's called? I had a lot of questions I found very embarrassing suddenly fill my mind. So I'm very excited to be here and learn along with our listeners.
I wish we could retake the Virginia fourth grade SOL. I think it's the first social studies SOL. I'd love to know what I would score on it.
Oh yeah.
I think you probably know more than you think you do. I think as we go through this, you'll be like, oh yeah, I knew that.
We'll see.
Do you know how many houses the General Assembly has?
I imagine it has 2. But that's just based on a lot of legislative bodies have 2.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. Okay, so here are some basics about the General Assembly, and we're just gonna schoolhouse rock it. We're gonna go through and talk about what the General Assembly is and what it does, and hopefully answer some questions that y'all might have. And at the end, we're going to talk about, what should you do with this information? How should we interact with news about the General Assembly? Okay, so the General Assembly has 2 houses. It's a bicameral legislature, very similar to Congress, with an upper house, the Virginia State Senate or the U.S. Congress Senate, and a lower house, the Virginia House of Delegates, or, the House of Representatives in Congress. But I will say Virginia had a bicameral legislature first. The Virginia House of Burgesses was a bicameral legislature that formed in 1642. And the United States did not have a bicameral legislature for another 150 years in 1787. So today, the Virginia General Assembly, like I said, 2 houses. The House of Delegates has 100 representatives, and the Senate has 40 representatives. And when I say Senate or senators in this episode, I'm talking about Virginia. We're not going to talk about Congress very much in this.
So can I ask, what is the difference between senators versus delegates? Is there any, large difference in their terms or their responsibilities?
So I would say for all intensive purposes, no. The biggest difference is how many people they represent. Each Senate district has about 200,000 people, which is about the population of the city of Richmond, if you need a visual. And each House of Delegates district has about 90,000 people, which is about the population of the city of Roanoke. There are fewer senators. They get paid a tiny bit more. The processes that they go through are very similar on both sides. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that because there's only 40 state senators versus 100 delegates, that they have a little bit more power or more sway. But they're very similar. The districts are, in both cases, based on, population density of an area. So, if you think about Congress, the Senate is representative of the United States in a very different way than the House of Representatives.
Right,
so
absolutely.
The Senate, the House of Representatives reflects population density, and the Senate does not reflect population density at all. In the Virginia state legislature, both reflect population density.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And the history of this is pretty interesting. Virginia's had a bunch of constitutions over the years. Since the 1776 Virginia Constitution, we have apportioned seats in both the House of Delegates and the Senate, kind of roughly by population density. The House has always been larger than the Senate. And interestingly, in the 1776 Virginia Constitution, the 1830 Virginia Constitution, and the 1868 Virginia Constitution, they apportioned seats in the House of Delegates and the state Senate in a way that tilted power to parts of the state that had plantations and slavery and slave owners, the eastern part of the state. Because, until the Civil War, West Virginia, what we think of as West Virginia, was part of Virginia. And so, there was less population density in that part of the state, and also the people living there had a lot less electoral power because of the way that the Constitution broke up both delegation in both houses.
So, of course, my next question is going to be about districting. And as you said, both of these houses of the legislature are determined by population density. But what's the difference between them, and what determines one over the other? Why do we have 40 of one and 100 of the other?
Yeah, so I did some digging, and I didn't find like a specific substantive or symbolic reason for, 100 House of Delegates representatives and 40 state senators. If listeners know the answer, please write in, because I would love to know. The 140 number first shows up in the 1902 Constitution. In the previous Constitution, the number of delegates is related to the number of counties in the state. It's always been, in the range of 100 delegates and 40 state senators going back to the 1776 Constitution. So I think they did some experimentation. They found a number that worked for them, and they put it in the Constitution in 1902, and it's just kind of stuck. But you also asked about districting. How do they draw the lines? And the historical answer is gerrymandering. They would draw them for political purposes. So, going back to the example that I just gave about how they apportioned the representatives to give slaveholding parts of the state more power, drawing the district lines was a highly political process until very recently. So every 10 years, there would be a census, and then after the census, the party in power would draw the district lines to maximize their chances of winning elections. But in 2020, the General Assembly and us as voters in a referendum elected to start a new redistricting commission that would attempt to draw the districts in a more nonpartisan manner. It's a long story that Bold Dominion did an episode about in 2021. But as of 2023, Virginia state Senate, state house districts really are pretty fair. They're compact, they're contiguous, and they do a much better job of reflecting the communities that people actually live in and interact with.
Okay, so once we kind of get down to where we're electing and how many people, what about the people we end up electing? How long do they work for throughout the year? Are they full-time legislators?
Great question. So we have a part-time legislature. So that means that, at least in theory, the delegates and the senators are only working a few months out of the year, and in practice, they are definitely only being paid as if they are working a few months out of the year. So the General Assembly starts session every year on the second Wednesday in January. In odd years, the General Assembly runs about 30 days, and in even years, it runs 60 days. And that's because Virginia only passes a budget every other year. So in even years, we pass a 2-year budget. And this is really important to remember because it's going to come up over and over again in this discussion. So this year, 2025, we are not passing a budget. We have a 30-day session. And last year, 2024, they passed a 2-year budget, and they had a very long session, which we'll talk about more. And the timing of this, in the winter is kind of interesting. It's always been in the winter. And, it's after elections are held in November. And I'm pretty sure they hold it in the wintertime because, back in the 18th, 19th century, again, most of our representatives were powerful slave-holding plantation owners who were running agricultural operations. And winter is not harvest season. It's not planting season. It's the time of year when they could leave their districts and come to Richmond for a few months to meet in the General Assembly.
I really got to say, even when you said part-time, 1 month out of, every other year and 2 months out of every other year sounds like a crazy short amount of time to do what is like very important work.
Yeah. So they don't actually only spend that amount of time on it. So according to the National Conference of State Legislators, Virginia legislators report spending about 2/3 of their time on General Assembly work. And they get paid about $18,000 a year to be a delegate or a senator. So, I think if you were to do this out hourly, like ask them how many hours do you spend, there's like no way that for most of our representatives that $18,000 is meeting the minimum wage in Virginia.
Right, of course.
And, I think the idea is it's like a part-time legislature that like is representative of the state and people can go off and do other things and they're only working for a couple months. But like in reality, this goes back to that landed gentry thing, right? Like this legislature was designed for people who were plantation owners, who were powerful men in the state. And again, dates back to a time where women couldn't vote, where there were a very large number of enslaved people who could not vote. And, these days, this part-time legislature, it really limits who's able to run for office.
Absolutely.
Because there really is an expectation, I think. At the very least, there's a general practice that it's not a part-time job. And I will say that delegates and state senators do get some funding to hire a legislative assistant, and those people are full-time. So for every delegate or senator, they have, one state employee, legislative assistant, and the General Assembly allocates $50,000 to $60,000 of state funding per representative to pay their legislative assistants.
That's very interesting that we would have full-time assistants for supposedly part-time representatives.
I am also fascinated by this. I'm curious when legislative assistants became professionalized in this way. Both staff and delegates get a per diem on top of what they're paid during the session. And that's because the idea is that they don't live in Richmond, right? They live across the state in the districts that they represent. So they need a little bit of extra money to be able to be in Richmond for those couple months. The other kind of caveat to this is that there are very few regulations on what Virginia representatives can spend campaign funds on. There have been efforts, most years to change this, but especially compared to other states, there are no laws saying that Virginia representatives can't spend campaign funds on personal expenses.
Oh, interesting. So the protections are pretty low in terms of use of funding. Okay. While we're still on the topic of how these sessions are split up, 30 days seems really short. Is that common amongst states?
We're on the shorter side, but we're not a total outlier. Most states do have a limit on how long the session is. They do not go all year round. The timing is linked to it being a part-time legislature. Now, especially in recent years, special sessions have become pretty common. But yeah, it's not totally unusual to have, only 2, maybe 3 months for the state legislature to meet.
So the reason we're talking about the General Assembly today is because their session started this year on January 8th. How do they begin?
Yeah, so the session did open on January 8th. I will say this year they got a little bit of a late start because they came to the Capitol and there was no running water. And there was no running water in the city of Richmond because of the snowstorm. And so they came in, they opened the session, and then they all left because no one had showered in days. So the General Assembly opened. It is now, they are now meeting as normal. The water is back on in Richmond. But the legislative cycle really starts in the summer for those budget years and in the fall for non-budget years like this year. So before the session, legislators prep their ideas for new bills. So thinking about them, talking to constituents, getting feedback, that kind of thing. And then pre-filing opens before the session. So this year, pre-filing opened in mid-November, like kind of right after the elections, again, because it's a non-budget year. And last year, pre-filing opened in July because it was a budget year and they needed more time. So this is really interesting. This is something I'd never thought about before. I just assumed that our representatives sat down and wrote the bills, But according to the General Assembly website, typically a representative will take their proposal to the Division of Legislative Services, which is, their state employees, and a staff attorney that works for the Division of Legislative Services, or the DLS, will take that proposal and compare it to existing law. And if it, doesn't already exist or conflict with existing law, then they'll check the Constitution and make sure that the proposed law is constitutional. And then DLS drafts the bill, and they send the draft back to the representative for review. And again, this makes sense. Part-time legislature, not all of our representatives are attorneys. So that's an interesting way that staff plays into this process. So the DLS drafts the bill, then the member, reads the bill, at least hopefully they read the bill. And then if they're happy with the draft and they're ready to submit it for consideration, then they'll sign it and they'll introduce the bill to the session. And then once the General Assembly convenes, it operates a lot like Congress does. So they open and the bills get sent to committees based on the topic of the bill. The House of Delegates has 14 committees and the Senate has 11 committees, but they're very similar. We've got Appropriations Committee, Transportation Committee, Education, Public Safety, that kind of stuff. So people propose bills and then the committees start reading and talking about them.
So our representatives are more like the idea people, right? They're not full-time. They're just there to literally just represent the people they represent, come to the Capitol with ideas, and then they're helped by staff to put those into a written bill. Then when they're in session, that's like the workshop time. They're all talking about, how certain things need to change in order to get passed, or in order to potentially have support of everyone in the delegation.
Yep. So that's where we're at right now. Committees are looking at bills, they're discussing them, and they're voting on them. If a committee approves a bill, then it goes to the floor of either the House of Delegates or the Senate. These processes are happening in parallel in each house. And even though we're only halfway into the session, we're actually approaching a big deadline, which is crossover. So the House is going to do floor votes on all of the bills that came out of committee, and the Senate is going to do floor votes on all of the bills that came out of committee. And then if the House passes a bill, it goes over to the Senate, and if the Senate passes a bill, it goes over to the House of Delegates. And then the process kind of starts over because for a bill to go to the governor to be signed, it needs to be passed by both houses. And what's common is that very similar bills will get proposed on the House and the Senate side. So let's say on the House side, you want to create new funding to protect watersheds in Virginia. Maybe on the Senate side, there's another legislator that you're working with who's proposing a very similar thing. So often there's very similar legislation being coordinated in both houses, and then we have crossover. So if there are any meaningful differences between the version that the House of Delegates passed and the version that the state Senate passed, they'll create a conference committee and they'll come up with one version that's passed by both houses.
Okay, and after that, it's sent to the governor for review. And presumably he can veto them or sign them into law.
Yes. So this is something that was really interesting because I assumed there were two choices, right? That he could sign it or he could veto it. There are actually 4 choices that the governor has. So once a bill has been passed by the House and the Senate, the General Assembly adjourns for 6 weeks. And that gives the governor's office time to review all of the bills that the General Assembly has passed, or if it's a budget year, review all the bills and the budget. And then the governor has, like I said, 4 options. So the first option is that the governor can sign it into law. So he's like, yep, this bill is great. In that case, he signs it into law. It does not go back to the General Assembly. And typically, new laws take effect either July 1 that year or January 1 the next year. So most bills that are passed in this General Assembly session will take effect on July 1, 2025. Okay, so that's option 1. He signs it into law. Option 2 is the governor vetoes it. And in that case, the bill does actually go back to the General Assembly because if they have 2/3 vote in both houses, the General Assembly can override the veto. This is pretty uncommon. Also, the governor is sometimes aware if the General Assembly has a 2/3 veto-proof vote on a bill, and that'll maybe influence their decisions. Because the third option is that the governor can take no action. So if the governor doesn't sign a bill, it does not go back to the General Assembly, and it becomes law without the governor's signature. So if a bill comes before the governor and the governor doesn't like the bill, but it's a super popular bill in the General Assembly, and the governor thinks 2/3 of representatives in the General Assembly, they're going to override my veto, they might choose this option. They might choose to not sign the bill, but let it pass into law.
It's a little bit of a political move for constituents who are watching.
Yep.
It sounds like. Okay.
Yeah, totally. And then the fourth option is that the governor can make amendments to a bill. So the bill goes in front of the governor and they don't veto it, they don't sign it, they say, I'm going to make all these changes. And in that case, it goes back to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly can approve it with a majority vote or not approve the amendments. So, for example, if the governor looks at your coastal protection new grant program that you want to start, and they say, this is too much money, I want to make it $5 million less, then they'll send that amendment back to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly can say, with just a simple majority vote, we can live with $5 million less. They vote yes on the amendment, and it passes into law. Or they can say, we will not settle for $5 million less. They vote no on the bill, majority vote no, and it goes back to the governor. And the governor has the same 3 options that he did before. He can veto it, he can sign it into law, or he can choose not to sign it, in which case the original legislation passes into law.
You say it goes back to the General Assembly, but they're only together for 30 or 60 days, depending on the year. So when does that happen?
Yes. Okay, so you know how I said that the session is 30 days in odd years and 60 days in even? It's actually a little bit longer if you count reconvened session. So the regular session is 30 days or 60 days. Then they take that 6-week break where the governor goes through all the bills, vetoes, signs, etc. And then every year, the delegates come back to Richmond for reconvened session, which is typically 3 days. And this year, it'll start on April 2nd. And in those 3 days, they will make those decisions on the governor's vetoes and amendments.
So no new laws are proposed during that time. They're just dealing with old business.
Yep.
So, okay, everything you're saying, it sounds like it's all supposed to be over by April on any given year. But wasn't the General Assembly meeting like all through the summer last year?
Okay, yeah, this is a great question. Also one that I had, because I just remember hearing General Assembly news like for what felt forever. So first off, 2024 was a budget year. It was longer to begin with. So the regular session was January 10th to March 9th. And an interesting thing about budget years is, we talked about pre-filing with bills. And the governor also kind of pre-files the budget. So the governor will propose a budget in December, and then the General Assembly will consider that budget. So last year, 2024, it was a budget year. Governor proposes the budget. The Democrats controlled both houses of the General Assembly, and they made some significant changes to the governor's proposed budget. The session ends on March 9th. They adjourn. They send it back to Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. And, he's not happy with these changes. So he proposed 233 budget amendments. And the Dem-controlled House of Delegates comes back 6 weeks later on April 17th, and they reject all 233 of the governor's budget amendments. So we're at a little bit of an impasse here, right?
Right.
The Democratic-controlled General Assembly and the Republican governor are not able at this point to agree on a budget. And this is really stressful because at this point, it's April 17th, and a new fiscal year starts on July 1, and with no budget, Virginia would have had a state government shutdown.
Right.
So, people aren't being paid. We're not making payments on our debts, just like federal government shutdown, but for state bureaus and employees. So that's not good. So in order to avoid that, last year, the General Assembly voted to hold a special session and basically come up with a new budget that the governor would sign. They voted to start the special session on May 13th. So between April 17th, which was the beginning of the reconvened session, and May 13th, which is the beginning of the special session, the Democrats were basically scrambling and presumably negotiating with the governor's office to put together a new document. And they opened special session on May 13th. And the General Assembly passed a budget, and Governor Youngkin signed it. So they averted a government shutdown. They were able to come up with a budget for 2 years that everyone could live with that, will take us through the end of Governor Youngkin's turn. And I will say, special sessions are pretty common these days. We had a few during COVID. And I will say, the special session rules kind of break my brain a little bit. Because, especially with divided government that we have now, the General Assembly can use special session rules to kind of get some leverage over the governor when it comes to appointments. So they didn't actually adjourn the special session on May 13th when they passed the budget. They recessed the session. So they were not meeting or discussing bills in the General Assembly. They did not have any more votes, but they did not technically adjourn. And this whole loophole thing, I find it super confusing. But, also some of these little technical details are not totally essential for most of us as voters to be plugged into what's happening in the General Assembly.
Wow. Okay. So the story about last year that you just told, I think kind of explains why, especially in times of divided government, we might want to be updating a budget every 2 years. But why? Why do it that often as opposed to any other time frequency?
Yeah. I mean, good God, could you imagine if we had to do this every year? Especially in divided government, they just went back and forth so many times. So that's one reason, it's just more efficient to do it every other year. It also gives agencies the ability to plan more than 1 year in advance, which I think is really valuable. Also, I think it makes it easier to pass non-budget bills. Like if every year were a budget year and all the focus was on the budget, it would be hard for some of these like non-budget bills to get much attention. And another interesting thing about like the budget process is that historically the General Assembly came up with a budget on its own. It wasn't until 1918 that the governor started preparing a budget to propose to the General Assembly. And, under divided government, the General Assembly does make a lot of changes. But if you think about it, in 1918, Virginia's population was only 2 million people. Now it's 9 million people. And there is just a lot more public education. There's more roads. There's more public transit. There's more hospitals. Like, there's just a lot more going on that the state is involved in than there was in the 19th century. So there's still plenty in the budget for the General Assembly and the governor to fight over. But there's also just like so much nonpartisan stuff in the budget that having that document prepared by the executive branch, which oversees all the like state agencies, is really necessary in the 21st century.
Wow. Okay.
Did I cover everything?
Oh, I think I have a much better grip on what we're dealing with here. And I would say, I guess the short form answer for anyone who's like, what the heck, is if you know anything about federal Congress, it's very similar, except that what kind of type of region you're representing is not different between the two houses.
Yeah, I think something that makes it feel really intimidating is that it's so short and it goes by so fast. Like, we're used to hearing about Congress all year round, but the General Assembly is like a really intense couple months in the spring.
Yeah, and it's also, we often talk about like, don't just care about federal politics, care about your state and local. But it's hard to do that when you're not necessarily seeing news about this on television all the time. Maybe you're hearing about it on the radio, but it's a little harder to kind of keep track when their sessions are so quick and you might not understand all of the kind of time limitations that are placed upon it.
Yeah.
So what should we do with this information if we're hoping to kind of be more active in our appreciation of what is happening in the General Assembly?
Yeah. So one tip that I would give is when you're consuming news about the General Assembly session, the first thing I would look for is this news about a proposed bill or about like a committee discussion? Or is this news about a bill that's been passed? Because there is always a ton of great, interesting reporting about bills that get proposed, but that don't necessarily have a great chance of passing. So if you're feeling really overwhelmed, what I would recommend is, first of all, picking a couple issues that you're particularly interested in. So, maybe it's housing policy, maybe it's education funding, that kind of thing. And then looking for organizations that like work with the General Assembly or are lobbying the General Assembly or are like providing information on that topic. So if you want to track like specific new legislation, I would, recommend trying to narrow in on like a couple things that interest you. It's pretty impossible to keep up with every bill that's like going through the General Assembly. We have some fantastic reporters covering the State House in Virginia, but I think even a lot of them would admit that it's pretty hard to keep tabs on like every single little thing. Another strategy is, there's so much news when everyone's meeting this time of year, but you can check in at the end of the session when the bills go to the governor and then reconvene session when the General Assembly is responding to vetoes and amendments. And at that point, if you're reading about stuff, those are bills that are very likely or that are more likely to be passed into law. Or you can check in, at the end of the whole cycle. And a lot of places like Virginia Mercury and like Virginia Public Media, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, like they'll publish lists of like, here's all the new legislation that's going to go into effect on July 1. And you can use that information to, like, inform your voting, too, right? Like, it might actually be pretty useful to see what bills passed the General Assembly that didn't get signed by the governor. You know, again, in divided government, there's going to be a lot of stuff that goes to the governor's desk and does not actually get passed into law. But that's a great way to, like, inform yourself on what your legislators are, like, pushing.
Right. That totally makes sense. And since they're only in there for 2-year terms, seeing what people vote on and what goes to the governor's desk, it's like a quick turnaround for that to be usable information in elections. With all of the rigmarole around, 30-day session, but then we have to have a special session and all of this kind of back and forth, especially when there's divided government and things are not passed immediately. What is this the best way to be doing this? Should we be talking about changing the actual process of these sessions?
Yeah. So, this is just my opinion. Like, I'm not an expert on this, but I would say I think the fact that we only pass a budget every other year is probably good. Like, I think that makes a lot of sense. I like that it gives agencies the ability to plan a little, a year in advance. There totally are budget amendments that get passed in non-budget years, but in general, I think that's a good way to do things. I do think the fact that we consider our legislators to be part-time is a big problem and a barrier to a lot of people running for office.
Right. It sounds like very clearly sometimes this process itself, the actual meetings and going back and forth, lasts at least 6 months. And the other 6 months, it's not that they're not doing anything. Like they're still organizing, they're still thinking about what's going to happen in the next session and presumably talking to their constituents and stuff like that. So yeah, I agree that calling these people part-time and expecting it to be a part-time responsibility is a little much. And I agree. I can see ways in which, a person who's working for their living is not able to necessarily be a delegate.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think in reality, it means that people who are independently wealthy or like have a spouse that is well paid are like way more able to run for office than like your average person. But let's say, that it actually, like, even if it was actually a part-time job, like, most jobs will not let you take 2 months off in January and February. So, like, even if it was actually part-time, it really limits the professions that people can be in and also serve.
Yeah. Yeah, we're missing out on a lot of perspective, it sounds like. What do you think about it being in winter versus some other time? I mean, I think obviously this year there's like a clear reason why maybe winter is not the best time of year to suddenly expect a bunch of people to leave their houses and go to the state capitol for a month.
I'm totally fascinated by things like this that are just like vestiges of a society that is very different from the one we have now. Like, when the Virginia House of Burgesses and General Assembly started meeting, Virginia was a very agriculturally oriented state. Like, there were basically no other industries. And it's just super interesting that we've, like, never changed that over almost 300 years.
Yeah.
If we're looking at, like, 1642 as the first bicameral legislature. I think there are some, like, good reasons that we might consider changing it, especially to summer. The big one that comes to mind is like teachers are state employees. They're very affected by state policy. Education is a huge part of the state budget, which I think like that makes teachers well positioned to be representatives. And, that is a job where you can be gone for a couple months if it's in the summer when school is not in session. And like you said, the climate reasons, although, there's climate implications to having it in the summer, too. Richmond's prone to flooding when there's a lot of rain and stuff like that.
It's also so hot in Richmond in the summer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting vestige. I highly doubt it's going to change.
Right.
I will say, I think we will see, more special sessions in the future. I mean, we had a good bit during COVID because that was such a quickly evolving situation that needed fast responses. So, I think over time the General Assembly will be meeting in the summer and will be meeting in the fall, some years because they have to have special sessions to respond to emergencies, especially climate emergencies, as we see more of those. But yeah, I'm just fascinated by things that had a good reason 200 years ago, and now it's why do we still do it this way? Inertia is a very powerful force.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting me, kind of be here and understand a lot more about our state legislature. It's definitely something I think I'll look into to follow some of the key issues. But your advice about when in the process to really kind of tune in and pay attention is well received, because often, and this is true of any state, and we kind of see it on the federal stage, we'll talk about a bunch of different state legislation where, a bill that has this kind of crazy thing has been proposed in this state, and it makes for good clicks and awesome clickbait to get people to go to those news sites and kind of freak out over all the different types of legislation that's being proposed. But it's so rare that all of that stuff makes it through any type of, session.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It doesn't mean that they're not interesting or important, but and I don't want to discourage anyone who's really into following the General Assembly from paying attention to the whole process, paying attention to things people are saying in committees. I think all of that is really important. But I also think it's really important to pay any level of attention to state politics, and it's a part of government that's very easy to overlook. We think about local government a lot. We are bombarded with national news. And so if you're trying to come up with a good place to start and, you want to allocate your energy in a way that is sustainable, I think paying attention to the stuff that is most likely to pass is a good way to get invested, learn more, and be able to sustain that interest over the long term.
Absolutely.
Well, you've been listening to Sage Tangway, producer at WTJU, and me, Mary Garner McGee. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. We hope you learned a little something. I also want to thank our assistant producer, Sarah Bastianelli, for helping with research on this episode. You can find more Bold Dominion episodes, including that one that I mentioned about the Redistricting Commission, at bolddominion.org or wherever else you find fine podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for listening.